still the one that makes me smile. You're still the one that we're still having fun, and you're still the one. It was my anniversary this past weekend.
With what? I guess I should say, since I certainly know it's not with whom.
Is that some sort of dig because you know that no one would ever put up with me for any actual amount of time?
What do we say? Persistently single?
Yes. Okay. Yes. It was, this past weekend was my 23rd anniversary with the Scirocco.
Ooh.
And the line that comes to my head is, we're still having fun and you're still the one. It's just, I don't know why. I don't know why.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I did, last year I hit a milestone where I've had that car longer than I didn't have that car. So more than half of my life. And I went, because it was our anniversary, I sort of happened upon a Cars and Coffee and then in a borrowed car, which is kind of like, I should be always in my own cars on my anniversary. But happened,
cheating. That's pretty rude.
I think it's fair to say that given that I have a harem of 7 cars and I've driven thousands of others, that we have a very successful open relationship, my car and I. And and so I went home and I got it, and no matter what I drive, I get in that car and it just makes me stupidly giggle. I guess that's the point.
Then you guys should stay together.
I plan on that being the case for a long, long time. Anyway, this is another episode of the Carmudgeon Show where we talk about things that piss us off and not things that make us happy, because that would make us not curmudgeonly. My name is Jason Cammisa, and this is Derek Tam-Scott. And Derek is not quite... You weren't born yet when I got that Scirocco, were you? Just pretend.
Yes, I was.
Pretend. I don't know how old you are. No one knows how old you are. It's one of the great mysteries of the automotive universe. Is he 94? Is he 34? Is he 14? Is he a robot that only just says things like facts and
beep,
knowledge?
Beep, boop.
and yeah, are there like software flaws where every once in a while you like your hard drive crashes and you just hit the...
Yeah, it's like that scene in Austin Powers with the fembots. Never mind.
Wait, you have guns in your breasticles?
Only in case of emergency. Did we have a topic for the episode today?
Well, we could spend the next 45 minutes talking about my Scirocco, or we could talk about what it's like driving other people's cars. Because one of the fun things about that Scirocco is I don't let anyone drive it for many reasons. Number one, if somebody killed that car, I would have to then kill them. And that sucks. Like, there's paperwork involved and possible jail time and all the other stuff. It's just not worth it. Like, nothing good can come from people driving that car. Also, they could learn it's not perfect.
Heaven forbid. Because I'm sure everyone assumes that car's perfect.
Everyone does. There's a lot of pressure on that. Like, everyone thinks it's perfect. So, like when the Smoking Tire called and they're like, hey, we want to do one of our one takes on your Scirocco. I'm like, how about the cabbie? They're like, why? I'm like, you're not driving the car. And part of that was it's not perfect. I know it's flaws. I don't want anyone else to know it's flaws. Part of it is just scared. Like, I don't want anything to happen to it. So, if somebody writes off the cabbie, I will be very upset, especially if they get hurt doing so. But because then I won't get to hurt them myself. That's where that goes. But no, it's my favorite thing in the world. Why would I give somebody the opportunity to take that away from me just by mistake? But there's like, hey, I get all these offers all the time. Hey, can you drive my car and tell me what you think? And I'm like, this is a dangerous game. Like, I drive a lot of cars, and it's my job to bitch about everything. This could be a seriously bad idea.
That happens to me fairly regularly too, but I'm generally not that shy because the context in which people are asking me to drive things is because it's for sale. And so I have to play like a tough customer and say, if I were a tough customer buying this car, here are the things that I would complain about, just so you, the seller, are aware that it could be better in these respects. Some people are like, I don't really care, and then it's sort of our job selling the car to sort of explain the good points about the car instead of talking about why this one is rubbish. But the sort of rubbish calibration occurs because if you've driven enough good ones, or just enough of them generally, so you can see that there's this differentiation. This doesn't happen so much, I think, with new cars, new cars, they're all kind of new enough generally, and that unless they've been like grossly mismaintained, like incompetently or like in a serious accident, they kind of all work pretty well generally. But then you start, I mean, certainly for like a Ferrari 430, they can start differentiating. And if you talk about like vintage cars, then you can have a wildly varied experience from car to car just because some are good and some are not.
Right. And you also have, I mean, with old cars, you have a lot of variability in the way the engine is set up. You have carburetors, you have, manually set timing. Everything is subject to the mechanic who worked on it and his level of competence and level of detail. Whereas a modern electronic computer controlled car, it does the same thing no matter what. And so as long as there's not a check engine light on, the car is running as well as it can, and there'll be the tiniest little variations. Yeah, especially with turbo cars. Like, you're never going to get a big difference in turbo cars output. In naturally aspirated cars, maybe a little bit here or there, but if it's computer controlled, it's all going to be within the same league. Whereas, you and I have driven multiple different Ferrari 308 GT4s, and your warning when you sold me mine was, don't touch the carbs. And that's because it, to use your term that no one else ever used in the history of the world, it carburates perfectly. It starts and runs and idles and does everything right and never stumbles and doesn't do any weird things.
Yeah.
And you drive another one.
Just an achievement for a car with 4 twin throat Webers.
Right.
And I never touched them while I owned the car because it ran beautifully. And when I first saw that car in person, the only time I'd ever seen it was on the lift from underneath. And I told the mechanic, if the owner of this car ever wants to sell it, please let me know. And then I got the call a couple years later, and I went to see it, and I'd never seen the top side of the car. And I was like, oh, it's not as nice as I thought it was from having seen the underside. And so I was like a little bit deflated over that, and I wasn't sure that I wanted it after all. And then I drove it, and then I said, I have to have this car because it drives so beautifully and it works so much better than any. I counted recently, I think I've driven 15 of those cars, and it drives better than any other 308 GT4 that I've driven. Just even ones that look absolutely perfect cosmetically don't drive as well. And that's a typical experience. I mean, you drive a bunch of them, and a lot of times also with cars that are really freshly restored, they're not like done yet. And there's a lot of that last 10%, there's a lot of shakedown that has to happen. And if they just sort of put it all back together and it all looks nice, but they haven't done any of the dialing, the car is kind of a collection of parts instead of a sort of coherent experience. And so in addition to the stuff that you were talking about vintage cars having all this variability in terms of setup, they also have a lot of variability in terms of the lives they've lived. Because a car that's a one-owner car that is still, lives in the same garage that it did when it was bought new by the guy who's actually 94 instead of like spiritually 94 like me, like who has the original purchase invoice and every single gas receipt and every oil change and just sort of loved the thing continuously and never let it sit still and never let it get rusty. That car is going to behave very differently when you drive it from, a car that someone left at the bottom of a lake for 40 years.
I feel like you've just given me some psychologist nature versus nurture thing where cars that are treated nicely and talked to will drive better. I mean, I think you may have a little bit of explaining to you. You're like, the car who lived in the same garage, that's like saying the children of parents who did not get divorced and never moved are different than
a stable home environment.
I don't think opening the garage every day and saying, are you still comfortable in your room? Would you like new sheets on your crib? is actually a determinant of whether it makes a good car. But I think I see your point, obviously.
It's the amount of sort of love and attention the car received. If the car is neglected or it passes through hands of people who don't know what they're doing, or heaven forbid, an incompetent mechanic, then it's going to be ruined.
And honestly, there are cars that are incredibly well loved, and have a stable home environment and two parents who love them, and that drive like shit. Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to who maintains it. 21-year-old Jason, when I got that Scirocco, I didn't know how to work on cars. 31-year-old Jason, I was still learning how to work on cars. 40-something-year-old Jason, at this point, I know how to work on cars, but I have my own. The things that I fuck up, frankly. And so, my cars are going to be different, even though it's as well loved as it could possibly be. It's going to be more. It will have differences in how it drives to someone whose car has just always been touched by the best mechanics in the world, or, for example, one who's brings their car to Jiffy Lube to have suspension done on $1 million car, which happens. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think it's, I'm making fun of you, but we're agreeing. I mean, it all comes down to the quality of the person who drives it, and also, or who works on it. And also, the other thing is, if someone has that one car and they've never driven another one, and they've never driven, they don't have a wide repertoire of experiences
reference
from
points,
which to pull, right? They may not notice that things happen gradually on cars. So, steering gets looser and looser. Cars with steering boxes like old Mercedes, they just gradually get so loose that you wind up with literally 90 degrees of play in the steering wheel. Car still drives fine. You can drive around it, no problem at all. But I've certainly had plenty of old Mercedes that have that much play. And the owners are like, no, there's no play in the steering, because it just happened so gradually they didn't notice it. You put them in another one and they're like, oh, that's the way my car's supposed to be? Like, I just drove your 400e this past weekend. And so I mentioned this car, I sort of outed you last week and mentioned the car. It's a W124 400e. You can tell all the details, but the car is brilliant. I mean, the car drives exactly like a W124 Mercedes should. And that's one of those cars that, I don't know who did it, like you can tell us who maintained that car, but no play in the steering, no interior rattles except for one piece of wood that's falling off. Modified in a way that I maybe didn't love.
I'm looking for stock springs and wheels for the car. But yes, those cars in general, they need sort of the touch, and they need the sort of dedicated owner, those M119 motored cars, whether it's a 500 SL or whatever, a 500E, they need to be loved. And so many of those cars, because they were expensive new and then they got cheap, but the car still is expensive to maintain even when it's cheap to buy, and so a lot of them just end up really deteriorating. And so to find a nice one is often hard. You come across this with R129s. It was true of R107s. Any expensive car, actually, frankly. It doesn't happen to 911s so much because they never get really, really cheap. But with cars like BMWs and Mercedes. And this happened to me, so I had this experience yesterday. I drove, my first car was a BMW E28 535 IS. I had an automotive coming of age in that car for sure. Like, I spun it several times. I learned to drive properly. I tracked it. I did like everything under the sun because it was my one car. And so I'm familiar with those cars, and I've spent a lot of time driving them. And I sold it. And yesterday I drove one that was really well set up and hadn't driven one for several years. And it was just such a pleasure to drive that car because it was kind of like the 400e. It was just one of those cars that was loved by someone who knew the ins and outs and the tricks and how to set the car up properly. And it was just like a really happy car. A happy car. I say that all the time, but I have never had to explain it. But it's just a car that sort of operates as it should and has sort of good juju. It has a coherent feeling instead of being like nothing quite works right. There's non-linear or like things that don't respond the way they're supposed to or don't function, or sort of corners that were cut in the course of maintaining the car. And this car had none of that. And it was just such a pleasure to get in and experience one that actually functions as it should, because so often you get into these cars, especially cars that ended up getting inexpensive and being sort of poorly maintained or not maintained at all. And they just are such tragedies. You're like, wow, this is a crappy old car experience. And you forget that when they're really good, they're actually quite a great experience. Yeah. And the 400E is like that.
Yeah, and the 400E, that's an interesting one. So that's an era of car that's completely computer controlled, and there really shouldn't be any variation between cars to begin with, between powertrains and to begin with. And you saying that reminded me, back in the day, I lived in South Florida, and a friend of mine brokered cars for wealthy people, and there were 5 R129 500 SLs in our stable, in like his stable. I always helped him out. And the variance, there was no variation between the cars in terms, none of them had squeaks or rattles. I mean, they're like, 90s Mercedes. They were brilliant. So none of them had any build quality issues or anything else. But there was a huge difference in the power. And we used to, of course, because we were like 18, race them all. And we'd just be sitting next to each other at a red light. And there was one client of his, Mr. Waffenschmidt, And Waffenschmidt had an early 500 SL, and it was by far the fastest of all of them. I mean, it just left all of the other 500 SLs for dead. And on the other, there was a client on the other end. Mr. Waffenschmidt's gone, so I can talk about his car at this point. But the other client's still alive, so I can't. And that client never drove the car hard. It sat in traffic from the minute it was brand new, and it was dog slow. And so even on a car that's computer controlled injected, and the later 500 SLs were, there can be variation in power between, there's probably a good 20, 30 horsepower, maybe more difference between, the two cars. And Mr. Waffenschmidt was German, and he got it when he talked to somebody at Mercedes in Germany, and they're like, get in it and beat the shit out of it from day one. Don't break it in. None of this stuff is necessary anymore. Just go beat on it. And for whatever reason, it worked. His car used no oil, got the best gas mileage, and was the fastest. And the cars that sat in traffic used oil, and they just were never as good.
Well, and people tend to waft about in those cars, applying 12% throttle. And
they never get over 1,200 RPM. They never get cleared out, so they get plugged up with carbon, and that's probably what really caused the big power difference. But you're right. When you see one that's just works as it intends and where everything works, it makes me happy. What bothers me is people get in. I don't really notice. I have a rule that if my car has something, it's going to work, right? If it's got air conditioning, it's going to work. If it's got power windows, they're going to work. Everything works the way it was intended. Maybe not at the speed at which it initially worked. Maybe the power windows will get slow, or maybe the air conditioning won't be as good as it once was, but it still works. I was in a car this past week, and it's a really beautiful car, very nice. And the owner has asked me to report back on what I thought of the car, and I'm a little scared to do so because nothing worked. Nothing worked as it should. Every gauge has a needle that sort of does this, and the interior light doesn't work, and the air conditioner doesn't work, and I stupidly turned the heat on for a split second because it was cold, and now it won't turn off, and the headlight switch doesn't work, and they wired in a toggle switch somewhere else, and this is a car that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's and then
but
the suspension.
At some point it wasn't. And that's what we see now often, or what I see oftentimes, is that a lot of cars have appreciated a lot in the last 10, 15 years. And so when these cars, like, you take, for example, like a Ferrari 308 or a Ferrari Testarossa or a Countach, a lot of them in this era where there's a point where these cars transition from being to used cars, and so you buy one like a 308 because you can't afford a 348 or a 355, so you get a 308, but you can barely hang financially with it, and they're expensive to keep, and so things break, and you try to fix it yourself, or you take it somewhere locally because you know a guy, and he's like, oh, let me just do this. I've never seen one of these before, but I'm going to work around it for you, so at least you have a way to turn your lights on. And this happens all the time with these cars, and they get sort of just kind of crappy, and that's why I was talking about the home environment thing. If you have continuity and the guy who bought it new paid $100,000 for it, he's going to treat it differently, or potentially he's going to treat it really well, and that's why it's really nice to pick up sort of dirtbag used cars that are cheap, like Mercedes 400Es and BMW E38s and those kinds of cars, and W140 S classes and R129 SLs from the original owner, because the original owner remembers how much they paid for it, and they treat it accordingly. Yeah. Someone who picked it up at the buy here, pay here car lot for $8,400 or $4,400.
He's going to treat it like a $4,400 car.
He's going to treat it accordingly, and then when something breaks and it's a $1,200 part, they're going to be like, oh, I'm going to
drill a hole in the dashboard and wire a switch into it.
Yeah, exactly. And so that is, but the point I was trying to make is that these cars were used cars for a while, and so cars that sort of fell into circulation during the time when they weren't valuable, they end up sometimes getting sort of bastardized in that way. And that's what makes it really special when you come across an old car, and it doesn't have to be an expensive one even, You see this happen. These cars surface at Radwood, and that's why it's so joyful for me, whether it's, we've talked about the Navajo with the window sticker, or the, really pristine Tercel all-track, or, these sort of relatively unremarkable cars that for some reason have been beautifully preserved, and they become all the more exceptional because of that. And that happens whether it's a Ferrari or Lamborghini, or whether it's the dirt baggiest, garbagiest base model Tercel with a 4-speed that was sold in the 90s.
Yeah, fair enough.
For example.
And then you introduce the whole modifications thing, And those are the ones, like, oh, I did this, I did that. Those are the messages that I get from people. Hey, here's a list of, they don't use the word, horrible things that I've done to my car. I want you to drive it and tell me how it is. And my canned answer is usually no, because first of all, a modified car, I don't trust. Half of them are not safe. And my experience from that comes being in the VW world where, I had my Scirocco when I was in my 20s, so did all my friends, and we all modified their cars, and we did them in different ways. And I had a bunch of friends from Toronto at the time, and for whatever reason, the Volkswagen scene in Toronto is based around lowering your car to the point where it is in the bump stops, like fully compressed and has no suspension travel. And so this years ago, I hop out of my Scirocco and do the same road that I had just done, it's around the corner from my friend's house, in my buddy's Scirocco. And I spun it. And I was probably going 20 miles an hour slower than I was in my car, because there's a bump that I had never noticed that completely did like the hee-haw donkey, like threw the back end of the car in the air. And I spun it and I came back and looked, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, what is wrong with your car? Why would you lower it to the point that it has no suspension travel? He's like, you just slow down for corners. Oh, or, you expect that the car is going to be airborne 6 times after a little heave on the road. So you just make sure you're straight when that happens. And so like all of my early experiences were like that, or a friend that put the biggest cams he possibly could in a 16 valve, and made the most peak power. I just wrote a column about this for Road Track. Made the most peak power of anyone that we'd ever seen at the time, but lost a drag race to me in my stock engine car.
Because the power band was from here to here.
Yeah, somewhere. Yeah, it was ridiculous. It was, the car made obscene power from 6,800 to 7,200, and then the limiter kicked in, and he couldn't get rid of the limiter because there was just a hard limiter in the ignition system, and he tried everything. Yeah, it would have made great power if he could have revved it to 9,000, but he couldn't. And so, like, I tend to feel like most people ruin. There's an episode in here. When is it okay to modify your cars, and when is it not? We'll put that on the list. But there's
everybody drink now.
Everyone
we use the phrase there's an episode. We should do an episode about X topic. I will say that I totally agree with you. The older I get, the less I'm inclined to modify cars. I will say if they're beautifully done, then they can be absolute magic, and that has to do with the sort of level of expertise and knowledge of the person who did it. I've driven many modified cars where you're like, holy crap, this is spectacular. It's like this, because for me, the ideal modified car, I'm going down this path that we're not supposed to because we're supposed to have this episode later. I'm going to be quiet after this next sentence. The ideal modified car drives exactly like the original, but turned up to 14/10.
I kind of feel the same way, because if you have to modify the car to totally change the personality, it probably wasn't the right car for you in the first place. Except, I guess, if there's we have to shut up, because there are cars that have one flaw or one thing that's just universally agreed didn't fit everything else and wasn't right, and you can change it. All right, totally. That's a good episode. I like this one. But getting back to driving other people's cars, like, you are very free with just handing your keys to your car to your friends and swapping on rallies.
Yes.
And do you find that anyone ever listens to you if you say, like, you probably should fix X, Y, and Z, or this is a problem, or
about their cars?
Yeah.
Yeah, most frequently the response is like, yeah, that's on my list.
Okay.
But my cars are like that too. Like, I remember we were on a rally once and I was riding in a different car and someone else was driving my car, and we used radios when we're rallying to talk to each other. And on the radio, I get this call. It's like, how do you get it to not grind going into third gear? And I was like, just give it more revs when you're shifting into third. And he was like, oh, that solved the problem. You literally solved the problem for me over the radio while we were driving.
I know what car that is. Was that, I'm sorry, wretched Alfa Romeo GTV6 you had?
Yes. I really liked that car. There were some things I wished were different about it, but there were...
Like everything?
No.
But this is an example of a car that I think was ruined by virtue of its mod. So you had never driven a stock GTV6 when you got that car, right?
I'd driven one around the block only.
Yeah. I'd driven one once and I thought the car was magic. I mean, it was just, all the controls had this consistency and harmony to them. Everything did exactly what I expected it to. And your car was modified in such a... So
it was modified for track days and for high-speed stability. which
Right.
made it not that fun at low speeds and twisty roads.
I'd go one step further than not that fun and say undrivable and unsafe.
I
to
never
turn
died
the
in it.
steering wheel. Well, you got rid of it pretty quickly, didn't you? So to turn the wheel on a 40-mile-an-hour corner took. How many pounds of force do you think that might have been that you needed to apply to the steering wheel to turn the wheel?
It was probably more than any other car that I've owned. You also never drove the car after I removed about 50% of the caster that was in it.
But when I drove
it, shitload of caster.
Just keeping up with traffic on a normal road required more force on the steering wheel than parking a
Testarossa.
Oh God, no! Orders of magnitude. I mean, Testarossa is like an easy non-power steering. I mean, like a 1950s large American sedan with broken power steering, like, and our compound race tires in 3 feet of concrete.
Molasses.
I mean, it was just it was unbelievable how high effort that was. And that to me, just right off the bat, I'm like, okay, the car's ruined. Like, I can't drive it without really thinking, am I going to be able to turn that wheel quickly enough?
You should go to the gym more.
God, you were such a bitch. Stop defending that car. It was terrible. It was terrible. And this is the thing. The previous owner had lovingly modified that car to be used on a racetrack, fair enough, and did all these things like drilling holes in the individual gears of the transmission for lightweight so that there was less rotational inertia. But then the synchros couldn't keep up with it. So you go out of second gear and you go into third, and if you didn't do it as fast as you possibly could, the revs or rev match, the transmissions, the gears would come to a stop, and then the synchros couldn't spin them up fast enough, so you'd grind going in gear. So
but those cars always do that. Those cars are notorious for having garbage synchro match.
Right, but from the factory, if you time the shift properly, it all just works. And your car, he does this, but then leaves that ridiculous gap between second and third that had the early cars. So you were like 6,000 or whatever the red line was in second, and you go into third and you're at 3,100 or something. I mean, it was like, wah, and then the car doesn't move.
That is factual for sure. That car's so the gear ratios were not changed. The cars had garbage gear ratios originally. The early cars had different gear ratio, rear end ratios also. The car had a very tall rear end ratio, which exacerbated the problem that you're describing. Right. But yes, point taken.
I mean, I feel like I can beat up on the car now because you don't have it, and I do it for sport, really. I mean, it was stunningly beautiful, and it shockingly beautiful, and
it functioned really well too. Like, it was reliable. Like, it never did any of the garbage Alfa Romeo things that those cars do.
Right.
And in that sense, it was very trustworthy.
Garbage Alfa Romeo things.
Yeah, because of the 164, which was a garbage Alfa Romeo.
The funny thing was, you and I we test drove a 164 24 valve.
And the black one.
The black one. And I didn't drive it. I was just in the passenger seat. I have never heard a six-cylinder sound better. Yeah. Never in my life it sounded better than almost every V12 I've ever experienced. It was fucking magic. And you loved it, right? Like, it actually drove really well.
I agreed to buy it, and I took it for a PPI, and the car had $7,000 worth of mechanical needs. It was like there was this massive oil leak. It needed a clutch. And the car had 55,000 miles, by the way, which is the quintessential 164 experience.
Well, but didn't it roll itself back every time you started it?
Yes.
Was that the car that
so one time I took the car for the PPI, and I checked the odometer. It's a digital odometer. And I checked the odometer when I arrived, and the car had fewer miles when I arrived at the shop than when I had left the consignor's warehouse.
This is what you mean when alpha bullshit.
Totally. But the car was very nice cosmetically. It looked like a 50,000-mile car. I believe the mileage was approximately correct. I have no idea why it did what it did, but I've never had a more just outrageously terrifying PPI ever than I had.
Literally more in repairs than you were going to have to pay for the car.
Just about. It was close.
I mean, yeah. And that's funny. It's ironic because the car drove well. I mean,
yes, it did. It functioned well, but yes, the guy said the clutch was slipping. I didn't have any issues with that. It had a massive oil leak, which I did notice. All the shock boots were sort of deteriorated. I forget what all it needed, but it was kind of everything.
I remember seeing the list and being shocked that a car that looked and drove and presented that well was
so needy,
totaled, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you had that 164 back east, and you bitched about that a lot.
Yeah, that was one of those things where you should buy the car. You should see the car before you buy it.
I know. I think you're very courageous. So this was one of these like.
That's a very diplomatic way to put it.
You're an idiot. No, that's not what I mean at all. I mean it genuinely. Like I keep hearing these like, oh, I've decided that I'm gonna go on vacation in insert name of place, and I'm gonna buy the shittiest insert name of car that I can, and I'm gonna drive it the insert number of miles between this and this other place that I'm gonna go, and I'll sell it when I leave. And that's just as someone who hoards
Does that not
their
sound
cars.
fun? That sounds.
It
fun
sounds
to me.
awesome. It sounds completely awesome and refreshing from someone who's had a Volkswagen for 23 years. And by the way, I think it's next week or the week after is 18 years that I've had my E30. So like clearly that, I do the long term, like I hold it and I have it forever and I would love it and hug it and kiss it. And then you're like, you for 5 minutes now. And then you move on. And it sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's like Russian roulette. Sometimes you get super lucky, and then other times you're just like, oh, I've made a terrible mistake.
Yeah, but you have fun either way.
My Audi, it was a great decision until the moment it wasn't, and then it wasn't a great decision after that.
That's one
representative of vintage turbocharged cars.
Right. Well, you've had plenty of good experience. You had that Jaguar, the Daimler.
Yeah.
That was a shockingly good experience.
Yeah, it really was.
Drunken accidental purchase on eBay, and
I wasn't drunk.
You must have been. You can tell me you weren't drunk at all. Who the fuck buys a 12-cylinder Jaguar thing, sight unseen in a different county? Like, you're out of your mind.
It was in Texas. I didn't mean to buy it. It was an accident. Anyway.
How do you accidentally buy a car if you're not drunk? I mean, this is the thing. I just keep coming back to that. You can explain this away, or you can try to explain this away as many times as you want. You might as well just say, I was really drunk, because then you look less crazy. Like, there's sometimes being drunk is a good, is a really good excuse.
I threw up a low bid and it ended up being the high bid. That's what actually happened. I've done that twice. I did that with a motorcycle once also.
I can't.
Yeah.
Like, I would only bid, I'm so neurotic. I would only bid on something I'm genuinely going to buy. Like
I genuinely bought it both times.
Fair enough. There was that Mallet Pontiac Saturn Sky that sold on Bring a Trailer, so it was a Saturn Sky with a 7-liter LS7 swapped into it, and I was like, I'm gonna throw a low bid on this and hope to hell it works. And then I'm like, no, because I'm not actually like, either I fly to Texas, because that was another one that was in Texas, fly to Texas and drive the car, and I have a cashier's check, and I buy the car and I drive it home or ship it home, or I'm out. I can't do this like maybe, but maybe not. I'm just not wired that way. But I give you credit. I think it's awesome that you like flew to the East Coast and just picked up this shitbox 164 that you had
and then put 1,500 miles on it. Over the course of which we did make it, but like probably approximately 10 things broke on the car while we were doing that drive, and we just didn't fix them. We just added them to the list of things that wasn't working on the car for the listing.
That's only one breakdown every 150 miles, or one additional problem every 150 miles. That sounds about right for an Alfa Romeo.
Yeah.
I think that's a really cool thing. But it also lets you experience, to bring it back to our topic, different variants of the same car. And once you've driven a bunch of them, you can really start to see the pattern.
Well, and that's why it's so magical when you get a good one. And you never know which one it's going to be. Because like I was sort of alluding to before, I remember we had this XK140 that was freshly restored. It was red, and it was very nice looking cosmetically. And just from the moment you get in the car, sometimes Roadster 140s don't have exterior door handles, but sometimes as simple as operating the exterior door handle to get into it for the first time, you're like, oh, this is not going to be a good car. Because like if the door handle is loose or the button is sticky or something like that, you're like, I see the level of attention to detail that went into this car. If this is how they treat like the first touch point of interacting with the car, then I can guarantee you the rest of it's not going to be very good. So the way the doors shut and the way the doors operate is like obviously the first telltale of when you're actually interacting with the car. But you can tell like from the panel gaps, if you're turning the steering wheel and you're getting scratching because there's some screw that was too long that is just touching something else in the steering column or something like that. And then like how easily does it start and does it carburate nicely? And this car was one of those cars where we were just like every touch point you interacted with the car, you were like, ooh, this is a point, it gets worse. It just kept getting worse. And then the opposite is sometimes you'll look at a car, kind of like the 308. The 308 that we both owned is a superb example of that, because the closer you look at the car, the more you like it. Initially you're like, oh, the paint's not that nice. But then you look at sort of how undisturbed everything is, and you operate it, and everything kind of works in this sort of the fashion in which it was designed, and it becomes this really sort of magical experience. And I think when people initially get into cars, they're attracted to what is shiny and sort of visually impressive, and then the more time you spend, the more sort of sophisticated you become as a consumer, and the more you can pick out stuff where you're like, wow, that's amazing. Like, this one still has the little factory radio anti-theft system sticker in the window because nobody ever broke into it when it was street parked and getting the bumpers driven into by, people in Priuses or whatever. And sort of little details where you're like, wow, this is kind of time warpy is what you're looking for ideally. And sometimes these cars that are kind of scruffy, but all there, and sort of just gently aging as opposed to being like ruined, are the best ones. And so it's always a pleasure when you're like, oh, is this going to be a good one or a bad one? It's like a Russian roulette, like I said. Right.
So what's the worst car you've ever driven?
Oh, God. So I've only ever driven one, so I have no idea whether I just drove a bad one or whether it was like the actually just that garbage of a car. It was a TVR. This is from the 70s. It was a 2500M or something like that. So TVR is one of those British companies that they just do this absurd thing, and because there's enough absurd people in England, they actually managed to sell a few of them. But this car just... You would drive over bumps and there would be this cacophony of noises that... I remember I went over a manhole cover or something, and the noise that came from it was so like catastrophic sounding that like my head snapped over to see like whether the passenger's door had fallen off. I genuinely thought like something important had fallen off the car because of the amount of sort of crashing and rattling and like important sounding noises, bad noises that happened.
You're a little sensitive to bad noises though. Because
no, this was like deafening. Like if you'd been in a conversation, you would not have been able to hear what the other person was saying because of the volume of the noise.
Okay. And the only reason I say you're a little sensitive is because you're like, I could never have an Elise. They make bad noises. And then your biggest complaint about my ill-handling, ill-behaved cabriolet, that's the most outrageous car in the world, was it made a lot of noise. Well, structural noise.
It sounded like it was going to explode, like the structure was going to explode. It didn't sound like the motor was going to explode. It sounded like the car was just going to shatter, and like that pieces would be flying off of it, and that we would be sitting there in
beautiful
Recaros on the street while there were like parts careening off in every direction. Like it's like I have some tolerance for noises, especially if they're good noises. Like Mira makes lots of good noises.
Of course it does. It's $1 million car.
But like,
and it's Italian
gear noise also, which is special about that car. In any case, I kept wondering whether the cabriolet was going to disintegrate.
When
you drive it hard.
Yeah, no. And look, you're right. I mean, it makes horrible noises, but you're dealing with I think your expertise and your experience is predominantly in cars that are built to a slightly better standard than a compact economy car from 1974. And I mean, that's what the Mark I Golf was. And it doesn't matter that mine's an 88. I mean, it's a car that went into production in 1974, was made out of butter and then chopped up.
And wet newspaper.
And then
they cut off the major structural component, which was the roof.
Yeah. And then, we'll just add this little brace behind the back seat. That's like the size of like... And as stiff as this phone cord, by the way, isn't this the coolest phone in the world? It's like there's a structural brace in the whole car. So you then add that to like 80s crap plastic, and you see the way there are I think 4 bolts holding that entire dashboard. There's not much holding anything together, and so everything it does this shimmy, and of course I have twice the horsepower that car ever came with at its max. 3.5 times the horsepower that it was designed to make to begin with.
Yeah, plus, see, this is the problem with modifying cars. You were just complaining about modifying cars.
I'm not saying the car is perfect. I mean, that car actually drives exactly the way, to your point, drives exactly the way it used to, just turned up to 14. So that, those engines were really always very vocal, and they were even at a 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 liter, they were a long stroke. Now this is a 2-liter 16 valve with 11-to-1 compression ratio and a 94 millimeter stroke. So you're talking about a very rough engine, but it's just an order of magnitude rougher than it originally was. It's not like it used to be smooth and now it's rough. And it used to be quiet and now it's vocal. And then all of the parts on that car, the other running gear, are all A1 stuff from Volkswagen. So that's all, it's the suspension from a Scirocco 16 valve, which just kind of bolts right in. So it keeps all of the same stuff. It's just the strongest version of every part. And the only thing you can't do, despite the fact that I have 3 braces on the car, is really make the structure any stiffer. And I certainly can't unshitty the dash. I'm not going to remake the dash out of leather. And so all the crappy plastic pieces are just doing this the whole time as the whole car is flexing. And then it winds up being,
cacophony.
loud. Being what?
Cacophony.
A cacophony of shit smacking around. And yeah. I am very glad you got a chance to drive the car. I only wish you had gotten a chance to drive the car in slightly other, like, less insane conditions in addition to driving it like a madman on a back road, because it's just stupid fun.
Yeah. I mean, the car makes me laugh. And so that's the ultimate standard of car for me at this point in my life is, does it make me laugh? Either because it's doing funny things, or because I'm laughing at it, or because I'm having fun. But for some reason, I'm seeking laughter in some form, and that's kind of the litmus test. And that's the opposite of the experience you get when you drive a bad example of a good car, which is like, the potential is there, and you can tell, like, oh, this aspect of it's actually quite good. Like, it's got a nice motor and gearbox. It's just that when you drive down the road, you're terrified for your life because the chassis behaves unpredictably, or
that's a really good point. Is when it should be better. That's the most opposite of
laughter.
Laughter, yeah. Like, it's such a disappointment when you get in a car that's just not been. Even if it's been, the person spent all the money on it, it's just someone didn't know what they were doing, and it's just the saddest thing in the world.
And this is part of the reason, there are many reasons why people fetishize original cars, original meaning as opposed to a restored car. Because as it turns out, the company that built the car, whether it was Ferrari or Porsche or VW or whomever, knows a fair amount about putting these cars together and how they're supposed to be. And as soon as they start getting taken apart, you start introducing possibilities for, like, incompetence or variance that is a little bit scary. And that's why sometimes restored cars end up so bad, either because they were done by people who didn't know what they were doing, or they didn't finish it. And that like I said before, the last 10% of getting the car dialed, because we went through this with the Miro, like, it was drivable, but every time I drove it, I'd have a punch list of stuff that needed to be, resolved further. And I would, come up with one of those and then go away for 2 months. And then say, okay, the car's ready again. Then I'd drive it again. And then I'd have another list, some of the same items, others were new items. And so it's this sort of protracted, expensive process that goes on with old cars. And if you don't have the commitment, or you don't have someone who's capable enough, then these issues don't get resolved. And so
And you assume that wasn't the case when the car was built in the first time, right? To your point about the Lamborghini having,
I was just reading actually a Car and Driver. I bought the Car and Driver article about the 400, the magazine, the original one on eBay about the 400e, and in there was an article comparing the F40 and the Diablo. And there was one section where they went through the punch list of stuff that was wrong with the Diablo, even though it was a new car. There were, like, the handbrake is loose, and, like, this is falling off, and, like, the seatbelt doesn't retract, and, like, there was a long laundry list of shit that was wrong with the car, which was pretty new. And they published it, which I feel like probably wouldn't happen. Well, the car wouldn't be like that today, and they wouldn't publish it today. But so
they'd publish it. Like something like Car and Driver would publish it. Look at what happened to their 30,000 mile or 40,000 mile long-term test on the Giulia Quadrifoglio.
Yes, that's right. They were pretty hard on it. Yeah,
but modern cars don't. First of all, typically don't leave the factory. Like there's a metric of problems per 1,000 vehicles, and this is problems that occur in the first 90 days or something, or some amount of time. And then, that has just gone down and down and down and down. And then press cars are gone through a second time.
Yeah.
Not only by the company, but then by the company that delivered. There's a separate company that manages all the press fleets. And they drive the car.
Well, and this was a customer car. So in the article, they talk about how both of them were customer cars. And they go through the list of things that was wrong with them. But
one assumes that it's not like, okay, that punchline would be, that punch list would be taken care of. And then the next time you drive the car, there's 68 new things that have cropped up. Because, that's my point only.
Yeah.
Is that, typically cars, if they have a couple of flaws, it's not this cascading shit show of, like,
yes.
every time you drive the car, some 7 other things break.
And generally speaking, like the magic about driving an original car, because there's some of these cars as they get old, like a vintage Ferrari, for example, or a vintage Jaguar E-Type. When you drive an original one, you're like, wow, this is how they were all supposed to be, and so few of them are like this because most of them have been restored or molested, even by, competently. It's like nice, but and there's also some wearing in that has to happen. Like gearboxes sort of shift stiffly. Like the Miura gearbox was so stiff when it was freshly rebuilt, and now it's quite pleasant and usable. And that stuff is quite typical. The motors will kind of wear into, and the oil consumption can potentially go down. And so these cars that just have that magical vibe of never having been taken apart, it's hard to explain if you haven't driven a lot of them, but there's definitely something to it, and it's kind of great when you get a car like that.
So what all you're saying is, I should let you drive the Scirocco so you can tell me all the things you notice about it so that I can add that to the enormous punch list of things that I know about, but you will never tell anyone on the show about this.
How noisy is the dashboard?
So if the structure of the Cabriolet is something, Jesus Christ, sorry, is something like this, the Scirocco is something like this. Actually, it's funny. They're night and day. Structurally, they're night and day. I mean, the Scirocco has no structure at all, and you know that, like, because you park the car in the wrong way and you can't open the door. You open the door, but they do like a open thunk because it's not lined up properly.
Because the car is.
And that's just how they were when they're new. And I have a massive bracing on that car also, and it's still that way.
Is this the type of car where if you're trying to shift into a gear while you're going around a corner, everything is flexed so much that the gear is not in the same place?
Somehow they got that
had
right.
that experience before.
Oh,
where
yeah.
If you're going around a corner, you're like, oh, third gear is not in that location right now because the gearbox has moved.
Yeah, no. For some reason, the VWs don't do that, despite the fact that they have ridiculously weak structures.
And the linkage is also probably a bit convoluted as well with those cars. And
I think they're so vague. And the shift linkage is. I mean, it's so the shift linkage on those old VWs is kind of hilarious because it's a rod linkage, but there's no direct connection. Like there's at one point where there's like a lollipop. I don't have anything here that kind of looks like that. There's like a steel cage that sort of can move, and then there's a lollipop that sticks in it. And you would think if you were designing this so that, it would all work together, you'd do like a Delrin or some piece of like, hard plastic that would go in and form a good seal with the cage.
Yeah.
Right. And then you'd be able to move it. But no, the lollipop is like a good 1/4 of an inch smaller than the cage is. So when they're brand new, they have that much movement and it's just soft rubber. So it wears out. So you can turn it 180 and like, extend the life of it. But at every 20,000 miles, those shift linkages are completely worn out because everything else is just, little bushings that the rods are going through and they wear completely out and they're destroyed. So most of those cars you get in and it's soup and people are like, the shift linkages suck in this car. Actually, rebuild one, they're fine for 5
minutes.
15 minutes. Right. And that's just, early 70s front wheel drive cars or mid 70s, I guess. They just hadn't figured out a lot of that stuff yet. But no, the Scirocco drives very, very, very differently. I mean, I have completely different suspension on it. Same engine, same transmission, same steering, same brakes. Everything else is different. So,
well, congratulations on your anniversary together. I hope you celebrate it by going for a drive instead of by driving someone else's car and having a potentially suboptimal experience.
Was that like an insult, basically? Did you just throw shade?
I don't think so.
Like,
if I did, it was accidental.
I hope you don't celebrate your anniversary by screwing somebody else, is what you just said. Yeah, thank you for that. No, you're right. I should probably take it for a drive. You know what I should do? Wash the poor thing, because it's filthy. But that just means it's because I've been driving it, so I don't know. So, all right, I'm going to go celebrate my anniversary right now. And you should go drive that 400E, because that's a pretty
Because it's pretty joyful. Yeah,
it does amazing one-wheel burnouts, too.
Yeah, and it's just nice to have a good one for once, because there's just so many garbage cars.
Okay, good. All right. Until next week, don't forget to like and subscribe and all that other happy stuff.
Happy horseshit.
I can't think of a better way to end. If you enjoyed the Carmudgeon Show, make sure you subscribe to the ISSIMI YouTube channel and click that notification bell to make sure you're told every time we publish something amazing, which is basically every time we publish anything. Terry done yet?